Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. Good morning, Chris.
It's afternoon.
Oh, it's afternoon. Okay, good afternoon. Well, it's bright and warm here already, so it looks like afternoon.
It's bright and warm here. We are officially in a heat wave.
What does that constitute, or what does that come up to?
I think it's 3 days where it's close to sort of the high temperatures we ever get. So, what is it? I think it's kind of 80s, but it's been like that since sort of Sunday, Monday now. So it's 4 days in a row of reasonably hot weather.
So actually, you are probably about the same temperature we are here now. We're probably about the same.
Yes, but we
Nice.
don't have aircon.
No.
Except in our cars.
Right. So then when it gets really wretched, you just want to drive around for a while and
Pretty much.
use up gas.
Yeah, which is like super sensible.
Oh, great. Well, we know that we haven't done any gaming, either of us. I'm pretty confident since we last spoke, since it was only 2 days ago.
3 days ago, but yes, you're still right that we've done no gaming.
So we can dispense with that, but I did do a thing in the last 2 days, and that was finally pull the trigger on releasing Ahris, my 2D20 WorldBuilders fantasy. Call it traditional or conventional or high whatever you want to call it. Not like anyway, we'll get into that.
Role play. It's on the front page.
Yeah, there you go. I released it on Tuesday. And so we're going to talk about what it is and what's in it. And you're going to pepper me with questions, and you're not going to hold back on tough questions, because I know that you already have some tough questions, and those are good. Those are the ones I want to deal with.
Jumped the gun. I thought we were going to do this and then you were going to release it. And then on Tuesday, I see this thing pop up.
No.
And then
you know what happened was, honestly,
people saying the links don't work.
I have been like circling around, jumping, like standing on the edge of the diving board for a couple of weeks. And my wife, and I thank her for this, just like, you just got to do it, just because honestly, perfection gets in the way, the perfect gets in the way of the good. And it's really easy with something like this to continue looking at it and tweaking it and polishing it and tweaking it again. And you find all kinds of reasons to not just be like, okay, there's a point at which nothing is going to be perfect. I need to get it out there so that I can actually get broader feedback. And the wonderful thing is that, if people buy this, I'll answer one of your questions right away, but I won't get into the details of it. Yeah, I'm going to release errata for this as needed. If there are sections of it, or there are portions that need to be fixed, I'll fix them, and I will re-release, and everyone who's gotten a copy will get the new copy. It's not like you buy, 4th edition D&D and you play it for a while and you're like, this sucks. And you don't just, then you have to go buy a different edition or a different game entirely. No, anyone who gets this is going to get access to the most current version. And obviously, if they have one of the previous versions, if there are previous versions, they can keep that. So anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. Then we can get into the details of that.
One of the advantages of PDFs that we moan about PDFs and we don't like them because we're old people and we like our paper books. But if something has problems in it, you can update a PDF and just give everyone the new version. Whereas something like, Shadowrun, so historically known for first editions of Shadowrun books, having not only typos all over the place, but the rules not working and all kinds of problems, and they need tons of erratas. So then you need to wait till the 6th printing where maybe they update the rules, because in some of the earlier printings, they won't do any of that stuff. They won't even do typos. And obviously, so then you might have a PDF that's totally changed. This is why I'm going to explain my... Go on, because we're not talking.
You go.
I would say this is what I'm going to explain my background. My first, it can't be a criticism because you've named this, and because you've named it, you're pronouncing it Ahris. So this character, there's 4 of her, is from League of Legends. She is called Ahri. It's the same spelling without the S. So it is Ahri, and she is Ahri. So my screen, there's 4 of those. So there's Ahris. See what I did there?
So if you put a fifth, then you'd have to pronounce it the way my game is pronounced.
Yeah. So, but it's your game, so it doesn't really matter. Although, didn't you put something in here about I don't really care how you pronounce stuff, or is that just a previous conversation we had?
Well, okay, actually, there is in chapter 10, the which provides the world background. I do establish the what I consider to be the correct pronunciation of various things, but also make it clear that there is regional differentiation. There are accents. There are, the door is open for dialects and things like that. There is a common language, but that not everyone sounds exactly the same. Gee, that's I'm not gonna. It's kind of silly to. I don't know. People in gaming and fandom play the role of gatekeepers way too often anyway. So I'm not going to do that. But that is, I do have a pronunciation guide for the terms and especially locations.
The one section I didn't really get to. I have to say, so I haven't looked through all this book. There's a very simple reason. It's not small.
No, it's not.
The PDF is 238 pages, and Jeremy sent this 2 weeks ago in the
it's 239 now.
Yeah. Now the version I have here says 238.
Okay,
you sent me this like sort of a week or 2 weeks ago in the midst of me trying to do exam marking. So spare time I don't have any spare time. So I managed to have I skimmed through it initially, and then yesterday I had a proper look at the magic section and then the creatures section. And then I went back as I was reading through the magic section because there was things I didn't understand. I had to go back and read earlier in the book because I'd skipped stuff before I worked out what was going on. Actually, we're still.
Well, let me do this really quickly. Just I'm looking at the table of contents. The PDF is 239 pages. The final PDF that has been released on DriveThru is 239. That's with a front cover and a back cover. There is a page that has the table of contents and the credits. And the game itself consists of 11 chapters, an overview of the game, which is very short, the core rules, action and conflict. Character creation is chapter 4, and there's a reason why character creation comes kind of later in it, and we'll get to that. Money and equipment, adventuring rules, magic, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bunch. Creatures and Foes is chapter 8, the obligatory chapter 9 of game mastering with optional rules and some additional ideas. A good chunk of that I took from the SRD and tweaked and polished to fit the world and my view of it better, but a significant amount of that is original work. There is the Ahris primer, that is the chapter that introduces you to the most basics of the world. There is then an introductory adventure. There's a one-page index, and then there are 2 appendix. There's Appendix A, which is just some like books, movies, music, things like that I feel like I've turned to for inspiration for fantasy stuff over the years. So that's just a 1 page. And then there's Appendix B. And Appendix B is about 30 some pages of printable, no background resources, like all the tables from the book are back there. So if you find a table in the book somewhere and gee whiz, I wish I could print this out, but I don't want to print the page. I've got all of those. There's a character generation worksheet that steps you through the whole process. There's a 2-page character sheet.
You just skipped 3 really important pages.
What?
You've put a page of squared little hexes and big hexes in your book. That is awesome. The amount of times you need these and you're like, I'm going to have to go and look online. No, they're in the PDF of your book. That's so
really quickly, Appendix B has all the tables from the book with no background, organized in what I think is a sensible manner. All of the qualities, all of the effects, and all of the conditions, all of those listed. Like I said, 2-page character generation worksheet, 2-page character sheet, a 2-page spell reference sheet for casters, a 1-page graph paper in blue, because that's what we used back in the early 80s, was blue graph paper. Hexes, a hex page, a large hex page. Those, like you just said, I figured, like, if someone's going to draw out a region map or draw a large, like, portion of a world or a city or something, they want graph paper, and you don't want that they're looking around online for that. So I included those.
That was really cool.
I also included all the qualities, effects, and conditions formatted so that they can be printed on standard business cards.
Yeah, that's
You
quite
know, those
cool.
like pop-outable business cards
Yeah,
you
that
can
makes
buy at
sense
an
now
office
why they've got these
supply
weird
store.
spaces in
If
it.
you want to
Yeah.
do that, you can go ahead and print those out and then hand those out at the table. The 4 sample characters that are meant for the pre-generated characters that are meant for the sample adventure, those are also in the book as well at the very end. So that's Appendix B. Appendix B is about 10% of the book, and it is reprinted material. So I mean, really, if you're looking at the rules, the whole thing, including the rules, is about 170 some odd pages. If you include the world background, you're at about 190 pages. You hit a little over 200 with the sample adventure. The other 30 some pages is printable reference material.
I mean, still, it's not small.
No,
It's a
it's
lot
not.
of work.
No,
And I
it's
don't know what
about
the page
5
counts
months.
of.
5 months worth of a lot of typing and a lot of
I,
reading and rereading and all that.
I don't know what the page counts of the other stuff is, but I'd be surprised if anywhere. You know, this is on par with some of. I mean, I bet there's a bigger word count in this. There's something like, you know, Dishonored or Dune, which are.
This is a little over 91,000 words in total.
Yeah, so it's a massive undertaking, and there's a huge amount of stuff in here. So it's very impressive for what like you said, you had to release it because you would have just kept adding stuff to it.
Yeah, that's honestly that was one of the problems, and I kept finding ways. I think part of it was well intentioned, and part of it was avoidance of, okay, I got to pull the trigger eventually on this thing. Uh, you know, like I said, letting the perfect or the perception of the ability to achieve the perfect getting in the way of, okay, I've got something that's workable. I think it's beyond workable. I've run it a bunch of times for different people. I've run it for people who had never played 2D20 before. I've run it for people who have only played. This last weekend, I ran it for a group, and 4 of the 5 players had never even heard of 2D20. And one of them had played 1 session of Achtung Cthulhu and 1 session of Star Trek Adventures last year with me at the game store near me. And I've run it for people who I would consider to be 2D20 veterans. A friend of mine has run it for his group for like one-offs when, you know, people weren't around and things like that. And so gotten a lot of feedback from that and tweaked things. But like I said, eventually, and if you are a person who's considering publishing through the 2D20 WorldBuilders program, there's just a point where you got to pull the trigger. And that's a tough one, but it needs to get out there. So anyway, how do we want to go through this in a way that will help people understand? I just wanted to bring up
from what you said, which is a massive sidetrack, and then I'm going to come back to a question that you already brought up first. It's funny how you're saying, like, you've run this for people that have never played 2D20. Twice in the last literal 2 days have I seen people bring up 2D20 as a thing they'd not heard of, and in one case, they didn't reference it. I saw someone on Facebook, I don't know where, in some like normal role-playing group, asking about like, oh, what's the Fallout role-playing thing like, you know, in comparison to like 5e or something. Of course, a bunch of people jumping on it and going, there are loads of other role-playing games other than 5e, you do realize, kind of thing. And I was able to put in the go, I've run it, it's really good play. I think it was on a Dungeon Master Guild. And then the other one, which was really amusing, was I was watching something on YouTube. It was about, I don't know if you know that the two of the hobbits from Lord of the Rings. It's the two British ones. Oh no, there's 2 British ones because the other 2 are American. So yeah, Dominic Moynihan and Billy Boyd, they have a podcast. So I had this on in the background because you can listen to a podcast. So I have it on in the background, and they had one of the guys from Critical Role, and they did a whole thing because one of them plays, and one of them has never done any role playing. So they were using the guy from Critical Role to explain how role playing works. And at the end of it, they said, "Oh yes, and we understand there is a Star Trek role-playing game system, and maybe we'll look into that because we both really like sci-fi." And I was thinking like, that's 2D20. Yes, you should try it. Anyway, completely off the point. Yeah, I'll pick up one thing and then we can come back to something else. You said there is a reason for having character creation where it is, because fair enough, it's not at the start. If you put character creation before the rules, then I think that is confusing because nothing means anything. Nothing in the character creation, so it makes a lot of sense. So it makes sense to me to have it after the core rules, but I found it odd that it was after the action and conflict, because often what you'll find is you might have the core rules at the start, or you might have character creation at the start, but the combat section will normally be later on. So you've actually got combat before character creation, and there is stuff in the combat section which therefore essentially like the stat names and things like that, which because they haven't been referenced at that point in the book, they haven't been referenced at that point in the book. So why did you do that? Because I thought that was like I wonder why he's done that.
Okay, good question. So again, the game overview is like just a couple of pages. No, there really are no, there's nothing like crunchy in that piece. The core rules are about 16 pages, 17 pages or so. And that's where, I mean, I think sometimes people get confused with 2D20 and they think it's like a universal system. They think it's akin to D20 20 years ago or 5e nowadays. And it's not. 2D20 is more of a core resolution mechanic with certain additional pieces, the meta currencies, that make it what it is. But then every version of it is a little different to fit the property or setting. Okay, so in Chapter 2, Core Rules, I deal with the core resolution mechanics and those pieces and parts, which I think my treatment of this is a little crunchier than Achtung Cthulhu, but less so than Conan. So if you're trying to put it on our like crunchometer continuum, it's there. Combat is a little crunchier than in Achtung Cthulhu, but not as far out as Conan. So it was important to establish the core rules because obviously action and conflict, which take up action and conflict take up the vast majority of a story. Conflict doesn't have to be like punching. Conflict is plot. You don't have a story. And I say that in there, like without conflict of some sort, you don't have a plot, you don't have a story. And so I needed to do the core rules before I do action and conflict, and actually the stats, some of the attributes, things like that, the things that are of the characters, I do give a breezy overview of in those chapters so that you have a clue terminology wise as you're reading. But there are two things that are of character creation that you cannot understand and do well without understanding the action and conflict rules. And one of those things is talents. All 2D20 games have talents in some form or another. And all of them, except for John Carter of Mars, offer talents. So they give you, and we all know this, like, Star Trek Adventures, Achtung Cthulhu, they all have lists and lists of talents from which you choose. I decided to not go that route. I decided to go the odd route, like JCOM, and have a system whereby you use points to write your own talents. And so since you get 3 ranks, you get 3 points to make talents as part of character creation, and you can't have a talent of higher than rank 2. So you can either have 3 rank 1s or a rank 2 and a rank 1. And in John Carter of Mars, the way, and this is generally how I've done it, is that one rank of a talent is roughly worth what 1 momentum would get you. So 1 momentum could get you a bonus die 20. 1 momentum could get you an extra challenge die. 1 momentum could enable you to re-roll challenge dice. 2 momentum will buy a seam trait. Okay. So one of the parts of character creation that I think is really important is this opportunity to make your character really personal. And the term I kept using was idiosyncratic, not in like the weird sense, but just like your character's unique. Your character is not a combination of off the shelf, out of the shrink wrap, UPC coded standard stuff. Your character should be unique. And so if you're going to build talents that would, say, help your character in combat or in social interactions or in exploration or building things or fixing things or appraising things, especially on the conflict side, you have to understand, at least in a academic sense, not like you've played the game in experiential sense, but in academic sense, you have to understand how conflict works in order to sit down and go, well, what kind of talents do I even want to build?
Right.
So that's why they're sequenced in that order.
That makes sense. I mean, there's nothing really in the character thing you need to. I was trying to find, because it was in the magic section. I really found something. And I was like, okay, he's using a terminology here that I don't know what he's on about.
Okay.
Literally no idea what he's on about. I think, yeah, whereas that I can't actually find that. And that was this thing about bonuses, because you've made bonuses go across every stat.
Yeah.
Now, so this is jump ahead and we'll come back on this. Not most, that's complete rubbish. In some of the 2d20 systems, you do extra damage. Usually, I think you do damage. You do extra damage depending on certain skills. And so these are usually something I've seen this in like Infinity and Conan. I can't remember if Actigraphy has it. But Infinity and Conan, what you'll often have is like your attacking skill will be like what you roll your attack on will be on one stat, but then you'll get a bonus based on another stat. So you kind of need two different stats to do like to be good at melee, and you need two different stats to be good at range, for example. And what you've done is actually have these attribute bonuses for any stat. And you've kind of gone, you've used that in your magic essentially. So you've got 6 stats: agility, stamina, reason, insight, presence, and all of them can have an attribute modifier where if you've got a really low skill, you get a penalty, and if you're really high skill, your bonus. But because I skipped ahead and I'm reading through the magic section and I keep seeing these things with this little B abbreviation, what the hell is he on about? Yeah. It wasn't until I went back and read through the character creation, I was like, oh, it's in there and it's explained quite clearly. And now I know what it is. But at the time I was like, what
is this?
But I hadn't read the book in order, so that was on me. But yeah, I quite like the idea of that, because none of the other 2d20 ones have done that. It's always been, you can do bonus damage to melee, bonus damage to range, bonus damage to, hacking or magic or whatever it is, depending on the game it was in. And so for you to go, actually, every stat can provide a bonus to, because later on, it could be extended tasks, it could be magic, it could be melee, it could be range. I thought that was a really clever idea. Once I worked out what the hell you were doing.
Yes. That is mentioned early on. It's attribute bonus. It's capital A, capital T, little b, attribute bonus. And then I've abbreviated that elsewhere. Yeah. Brawn, agility, stamina, reason, insight, and presence. Those are the 6 stats. And so like BR, little p, or AG, little b, rather, it would be like brawn bonus, agility bonus, capital R, capital E, little b, reason bonus. So a little bit of coding as you read through the book. Yeah. So each of the attributes has a bonus or penalty if you go below 6. And the reason I did that, the reason why I made it all 6, well, 2 reasons. One, I think that I would love for people to be able to use this. And I know the magic system is going to complicate that, but we'll come back to that. I would love people to be able to use this to point at 5e players and go, look, there are things in this that are like 5e.
Yeah.
Not as like you're shilling for it, but as a familiarity thing of like, okay, I'm familiar with these things, but now here's this other stuff that you don't know. If you want to teach someone something that they don't know about at all, you have to show them where there's commonalities so they have some solid ground to stand on, and then you help them into the places that they don't know what they're talking about or are entirely novel to them. So each of the attributes has a bonus or penalty associated with it based on its rating. And then there are 6 skills. Fight, interact, know, move, operate, survive. Okay, so pretty much straight from the SRD, all of them verbs. I love the idea in 2D20 I love the idea of interoperability between attributes and skills. So you develop a target number, just like the vast majority of games, attribute plus skill, but depending on the situation, you might have reason and fight if you're trying to like assess what kind of, I don't know, defenses or fighting style or something like that. It might be reason and or like, I mean, there's just a lot of different ways that you can combine those things.
Yeah.
And I wanted there to be an expression of someone's innate capacity, their attribute, to be used if there's a situation where a bonus applies. And I talk about those things, and especially like in, we talk about extended tasks, things like that. I didn't want attribute bonuses to only be related to combat. So
yeah, I just thought it was really clever. That was a really neat way of actually, for the reasons I've already said. Staying on, because we just mentioned skills.
Yeah.
Now, most other versions of 2D20, they vary the skills, because things like Dishonored have really weird skills where, like, your stats go from like up to 8 and your skills go up to 8, and they're really wonky. But most times we see skills have a rating of sort of 1 to 5-ish. And then normally in most games we've seen focuses be done 2 different ways. We've either seen focuses where, so in the original 3 games, focuses have their own ratings. You have a skill rating for expertise, which is what you add to your target number.
Yes.
And you have a focus rating, which is what, if you roll under that, you get, or roll equal to or under that, you get, it counts twice. So you roll a 1 or a 2 for a focus of 2. And then we've been seeing that changed recently into, if you have a focus, as long as you roll under the associated skills. So you have a focus in a particular thing, that would link to, say, fighting. Right. Well, if you've got a fight of 3, if you roll 1, 2, or 3, it's double, because you've got a relevant focus.
Correct.
If obviously you're using it correctly. But you've done something different. So I'll say what you've done and you can explain why. So you've got skills rated from 1 to 4. That's not a big deal. You've just knocked one off the top. Now your focuses are rated from 1 to 3, but your focuses are doing 2 things. Firstly, that focus is added to the skill and the stat to give your target number.
Yep.
Which we have not seen in any 2D20 game. And then your focuses are doing the normal thing of the double successes if you roll equal to or under them. So we have seen that kind of before, but yeah, the way you've kind of put that together, that is different. Now I know the answer to why this is, because you've told me and ran over it, and I was like, this is a cool idea actually. But for our listeners,
okay, so I decided to push skills downward because there are only 6 skills, and so much like Star Trek Adventures, they are very broad. Okay, in fact, at character generation, by the high fantasy version of these rules, you can only start off with a max skill rating of 3, and if you have any in 3, you can only have 1 in 3. Skills are, compared to focuses, more expensive to increase through the experience system because they're supposed to be broad in nature. And I like the way Star Trek Adventures provides skills, like they're categorical, they're not really detailed, and so that, I think, encourages players to creatively figure out different ways to solve problems. Okay, so I wanted to stick with broad skills, but obviously a broad skill is not going to be something you're going to be like master of. So what I did with the focuses, I like the idea of focuses that float. So in other words, unlike Conan or Infinity, and actually unlike Achtung Cthulhu, where focuses are permanently nested under skills and related to skills and only relevant to a role with that skill, I wanted the focuses to be able to move around. Again, I want players and GMs to be able to have the opportunity to easily, creatively come up with solutions to all different kinds of problems and not just approach things the same way over and over again, because that's what makes most sense mechanically. And so if you have a focus of, say, 2 in melee weapons, that is obviously going to be relevant when you are clubbing someone with a melee weapon, but it could also be relevant when you're using brawn and operate to maybe, quickly sharpen or repair a weapon, right? Yeah. There are a lot. I want people to think creatively and not get pigeonholed into just like, well, this is the only thing this focus does. I decided to add a rating to it because I liked the idea of, I remember with Conan and Infinity, I kind of like that, having a rating there, but also then it represents the idea that, like, you have this specialized knowledge about this area of stuff, and that should be reflected in numbers. And so focuses are rated from 1 to 3, skills are rated from 1 to 4. And so when you have a relevant focus, your focus plus your skill, that's what determines whether or not you get a critical success. So if you had a focus of 2 and a skill of 2, you would roll a critical success at a 4 or under. It's not just the focus range, it's the skill. And I think that makes sense. Like, if you have good general knowledge about, I don't know, good general knowledge, like you have or how about just make it really easy, like your move skill, you have a general athleticism, and then you say, oh, I'm going to have I want to have a focus in like endurance. Okay, well, it makes sense that you would then be more likely to experience a greater frequency of exceptional successes because of both of those things together. And so that's why I wanted to give the focus a rating. Focuses are cheaper to increase through the experience system. They top out at 3. You can add additional focuses over time, but they top out earlier and they're cheaper to increase because they're more narrow in nature. Skills top out at 4, but they're more expensive to increase because they're broader in nature.
I really like this idea. I think it's a kind of a good compromise, isn't the right word, but I can't think of another word.
I think compromise, or like a hybridization.
Yeah, hybrid is probably a better word. Like the move example you get is right. The problem with the current, setup is that if you have a move skill, your move skill is 3, and you have a focus in acrobatics and you have a focus at stealth, you are equally good at stealth and acrobatics. But maybe you don't want that. Maybe you want your character to be better acrobatics than stealth. So with your system, you can do that because you might only have, a focus of 3 in acrobatics. You're super good at acrobatics, and you do also have a focus in stealth. So good, you're better at stealth than just standard move stuff, but it's only a 1.
Yep.
Whereas at the moment, there is no way of doing that in the current system. Now, in the old system, like the original Infinity Coanax, there was, because you had like 18 different skills.
Yep.
So acrobatics and stealth were different skills.
Yep.
And even in them, you could kind of massively determine how good you are because you had these 2 things to raise. You had both expertise and focus. So you could have really high expertise and low focus, or your focus could never be above your expertise. So, but there was this second way to make yourself really good at something. But that was when you had a massive skill list. I think this is a really good way of dealing with a smaller skill list. Now, obviously, if you want something really simple, this has made it a bit more complicated, but it hasn't made it massively more complicated. Because at the end of the day, you're only going to have a handful of focuses. You've got a very small skill list, and then you've got a handful of focuses to the things you're really good at.
Yep.
But you can separate the stuff you're really good at from the stuff you're pretty good at. And I think it's a really good. I have to say I haven't played it, but I can see this will be super quick in play. It's not way more complicated.
Well, with the focuses, like there's what I've got and if you download the thing, you take a look at the pre-generated characters that are all the way at the back of the book. The target numbers that I plugged in to the along with their weapons and attacks already account for everything. And the character sheet has a place for the target number. So what you do is this actually doesn't, for your most obvious uses of skill focus combinations, attribute skill focus combinations, which is combat and like your interactions and things like that, there are places you could just write out those target numbers in advance. You don't have to do the math at the table. The only time you'd have to do the math at the table is if you come across a really weird circumstance and you're like, you know what, I'm going to use my acrobatics. I'm going to use insight, move, and acrobatics to try to look at this thing and be like, is that chasm jumpable or am I fooling myself? And you might not have ever considered that combination, but that combination makes sense in that moment. That's the only time you're going to have to do the math. Your bog standard uses and combinations you're going to write on your character sheet.
All right, I want to gloss over a couple of chapters really quickly because we've already been talking for half an hour, and there's one big section that needs a lot of talking about.
Yes, it does.
Because it's the standout section. It's the reason that, to not be blunt about it, it's the reason that people will buy it. People will buy it because they go like, oh, it's a fantasy thing, which is, higher fantasy than Conan. Right. They'll buy it. But then we've always said that there's one particular, I'm beating around the bush now. So like your action and conflict, saying it's standard does it a disservice, but like most 2D20, with the exception of like Dishonored and Dune, have a very similar like how combat works. Sure. And, you have 2 separate damage tracks. You do have damage like a physical and a mental damage. You've got the sort of, the 5 wounds is the 5 stress is an extra. Most of your language is consistent with the other stuff, so that's not really
here's my take. If you've played 2 or more 2D20 games, I don't think the action and conflict chapter, what I've provided, is going, there are some things that are a little bit different. There are places where I've, kind of tweaked it a little bit so it fits what I think this genre needs. But I don't think you're going to find anything that's like, whoa, that's so novel, or that's so bizarre, or that's controversial. I think it fits within the mainstream of 2D20 versions.
Likewise, your equipment, you've got both qualities and effects.
Yep.
Okay, which is always nice because, if those of you who don't know, qualities are the kind of things that every weapon has just permanently, and the weapon effects are the things you get when you roll an effect on a combat dice. So, yay, we've got combat dice. It's already a step up on some of the other 2D20 games because we like combat dice. All right, well, we like combat dice. There might be other people that don't. Your armor is, oh, you'd be fancy with armor. You have armor which is a fixed rating, and some armor uses combat dice, which
Shields.
is cool because that shields. So that's pretty cool. And the rest of this,
by the way, armor locations, like most of the games, hit locations, that's an optional rule. That's in the game mastering chapter. As it is the standard, you don't have hit locations.
What else are we going to say? You've got a whole bunch of adventure rules, which is the kind of things I guess you could. It's the kind of stuff where you don't need to look at it, but you've got it there, you know. So things like the climbing, cold, disease, falling, fire, you know, it's the kind of stuff that you've given rules, so it's there if someone wants to do it, but they can just wing, you know, you can just wing it.
Yeah, I mean, and I say this at the beginning of chapter 6, that all of these things are just expressions of the core mechanic. But I mean, if you want to make your life easy, there's disease and poison, there's exhaustion, falling, foraging and hunting, fire damage, things like that. I did add, I am happy with starting on page 85, I've got travel made interesting. I do have a quasi extended task version for, you know, okay, you need to move 30 miles overland. Do you want to be tedious and go every single mile, or do you want to hand wave it? And that's not really satisfying. This, I think, provides a good middle ground that is narrative, has some roles associated with, you know, the characters, so that they can use what they're good at and whatnot. And you can have a mechanical and a narrative melding of things for long distance travel. So that's in there as well. I'd say that's probably the most novel of that chapter. The rest of it is just the core mechanic expressed for these different things, so that you don't have to think, well, wait a minute, how do I handle climbing? How do I handle swimming? How do I handle drowning? Like, it's all there in, like, you know, short couple paragraph blocks.
Yeah.
And one thing, I'll say this really quickly, because this just reminded me of it, because I'm looking at a page. I went out of my way in the early chapters, up through from chapters 2 through 7. I went out of my way to write a lot of notional examples.
Yeah.
I think that's one thing that's lacking in a lot of the 2D20 games. And so I went out of my way for all the different kinds of major and fiddly and different rules things, or most foundational rules elements, to write an in-game example using a small set of, like, what passed for my iconic characters.
Skipping 2 chapters, you've done a pretty decent sized Games Master chapter, which, considering, you know, it's a PDF, it doesn't need a Games Master chapter, you could save it. But that's a good mix of, like, you know, again, standard advice sounds rude, but, you know, general, but there's not loads of the kind of advice you can see in other books. It's kind of, right, here's some really useful stuff, and then you've got a lot of stuff which is relevant to, you know, the 2D20 system and then your game, which is, you know, that's nice to see.
And the one thing I want to jump out and say about the game mastering chapter, the reason why I decided to include as much as I did, I have 2 reasons. One, there were optional rules and, like, Ahris specific things that I thought were important to share. The other thing is that, and this is something that I've come to learn actually more in the process of writing this monster, is that cinematic games, what makes them cinematic, I think one of the major elements is scenes. And the difference between narrative and action scenes. And I wanted to make sure that an explanation, and call it like a study of that, was included, because that is actually a subtly different approach to how you run and how you play a game than the standard. So I wanted to make sure that was there. I think that's worth it. I wasn't just padding page count.
You then have an absolutely massive, because I've skipped this bit, like, bestiary, I guess this is the right word, all of the monsters. You know, again, something like, they sound like Dungeon World, which is a final, complete, proper role-playing system, and it has, I don't know, like a handful of monsters. You've got a ton of monsters in there. They're all detailed. They all have like
60 or 70 total
different attacks on it. There's art in with these. I'm looking at the kobold again, because there's this really funny note where you've spelt it differently, and then you say, note the spelling is correct. It's an alternative spelling from mythology, which I just thought was funny. You know, you've got all of the kind of standard D&D ones, but then a couple of, like, less standard ones, like the Boogeyman, which is cool. Killer Tree. So, you know, I mean, when I was looking for that section, I was like, this section just keeps going. I was thinking there's like 10 monsters or something, quickly, and there's loads.
What I did, my selection of monsters and NPCs, I tried to be very deliberate about which ones I chose. And I think if you go through it, you will find in them representative examples and almost categories, because I have no intention at this point of writing like a full, beastie manual, beastie book or something like that. I have no intention to do that. But I wanted to provide enough examples to show people that the system can be flexible, but also to give people wireframes off which to build or convert their own stuff. So that's why I set a goal of, I forget what it was, 60 or 70, but that's how many things are in there.
There's a lot. I mean, there's more than I was expecting, because I think I've gone through, there's loads in here. And then there's a section of sort of like non-player characters. And it's
Yep.
well,
you need town guards.
Yeah. And then there was another section on undead. I don't know why you spun out undead onto its own section, but
because they're that cool.
But then there was like, oh my god, so there's even so like literally I thought I had finished and I hadn't. So that was a really cool section. I will throw this in here because I've used it a bunch of times. The fact that you have the table of contents link at the hyperlink at the bottom, which always takes you back to the table of contents, and then you can hyperlink to the thing you actually want to go to. Super useful, because it means navigating around this thing is like pretty quick.
Thank you.
That's really handy. So the big section, okay, which is the big fancy one that you've put loads of effort into, and the reason that hopefully people will buy this, well, hopefully they'll just buy it anyway, but the reason I suspect people will be more like, ooh, is the magic thing. It's the magic system. It's chapter 7 magic. We've said for years, literally since the start of this podcast, that the thing that 2D20 is missing is, we want a Skyrim or an Elder Scrolls role-playing game, because that would have a full magic system.
Yep.
Because we don't. Like Active Cthulhu has like a kind of an okay magic system, but there's no rules for how to add to that. There's just some examples of spells. And both Conan and what was the first? Mutant Chronicles.
Yeah.
The magic they have is kind of more ritualistic. It's kind of like it's fine for an NPC, but it's not really good for a player character.
No, it's very world, and it's also very world and setting specific.
Yeah.
It's not easily portable outside of those properties. So you're right. I agree with you completely. Like, where's the spell slinging system?
Yeah. So what you've done is given us a system which would, which comes from D&D. We have archetypes, and we have a bunch of spells. Now there are rules in here for making spells. I'm just going to point this out now before we get into this. If you were like, oh my god, I don't want to make my own spells, that sounds like a proper ball ache. There is a bunch of sample spells. Okay, most of the kind of things you would want to do in Magic are provided. So yes, there are rules in here for making your own spells, but a good chunk of the things you're going to want to do, like your standard attack spells and light, invisibility is not technically there, but you then did it as a example earlier on, so it is there, and it is there. It's just in a different place. So there are a bunch of spells in here. That's the kind of easy thing. It would be so easy for you to just knock out some more spells.
And just for the listeners, if you haven't looked at this, there are about 20 some odd spells that I provided. So there is not that massive D&D PHB, hundreds of pages of spells. I had no intention to do that. I give some sample spells, and for each of the example spells I provide a paragraph or two explaining how I use the spell creation system to reach that spell. Yeah. Some of them, frankly, are very easy, but combat spells are really, like blast 'em type spells, super easy to make. Other things like utility spells, they're more challenging. They're more challenging to work through, and to create a point-based system by which you build spells is easy for some kinds of spells. It's harder for others. And so I decided to walk kind of a middle ground of being very open about, hey, some of this is narrative and some of this is going to be decisions at your table as to how you do this. That said, I do have, and I think I think you're right. This may be the primary interest point or draw. And I think it's also going to be the thing that some people will either really like, or they'll be like, I really don't like this. So this could be this will be the hill the game will die on for people, or be victorious, is spell creation. Not just the creation of spells, but like the idea of going through the process.
I mean, I don't think it's overly, well, there's two parts to that. I don't think it is overly difficult, but I'm missing something at the start for how it works. I'm going to skip that bit anyway. I'm going to go into the actual how the spells, when you're casting them, is relatively straight, because we have seen spells like this in like that Cthulhu, where you have an attribute you use to cast the spells and a skill. because of the way you've done the spell templates, you essentially have, because I decided I didn't want to go into spell how we make them, but it links. Each of your base spells links to one of the 6 basic skills. So essentially, you're doing a similar to thing DriveThru, where you're using your standard skills to cast the spells.
Yep.
It's more complicated.
And I did that now. So you have each of the 4 caster archetypes, and archetype is synonymous with class, by the way. There are 9 of them, and 4 of them are casters: cleric, druid, sorcerer, wizard. Each of them has a governing attribute, the attribute that they use for casting. And then depending on the nature of the spell you're casting, it is related to one of the 6 skills. I did that deliberately because I didn't want people to be able to create dump stats for their casters and dump skills where, like, I mean, unless you wanted to make a caster that's just all about moving things or all about blasting things, well, then you just don't buy, you don't make spells that fit into the other ones. But having a balance of ratings in your skills is important as a spellcaster if you want to cast different kinds of spells. You're right. Casting spells, I think, is boneheaded easy. They have a fixed cost. Spellcasters have a third stress track called Essence, and it is a fixed cost. You don't roll dice. I wanted to keep things quick at the table, so you might have a difficulty 2 spell. You use your governing attribute and the skill associated with that type of spell. You roll. You can have a focus, by the way, in each of the 6 spell types. So you could focus in fight spells or move spells, and you would add that rating. You roll the difficulty. Whether you're successful or not, there is a fixed essence cost, and it's like dollars out of a wallet. You just spend it. There are no wounds associated with that special stress track. So it's not like, oh my gosh, that spell cost me 6 essence. I'm going to take some kind of a wound or a kick in the butt or something like that. No, you just deplete your essence. You deplete the track. You can't cast anymore unless you're a sorcerer. We'll get to that some other day. And then your essence track regenerates the next scene. So the throttle on spell casting is how much your spells cost and how much essence you have. So that's easy. Yeah. Using them is easy. The building of them is that's the more challenging part. Full disclosure.
So like the using it does seem very straightforward, and there's no real hassle there. Before we go on to the building them, then, so we do have these 4 different casters, and they aren't just like D&D style. Well, the only difference between them is which selection of spells. You haven't got a thing like that. They all have sort of a different thing on how they work. So like you've already said, like one of the sorcerer is able to essentially cast beyond their essence. How a wizard learns spells in terms of how many spells they've got. The others have to get spells through XP. The wizard can kind of find them in the game world, write them into the book, if you imagine it like that. I can't remember how the cleric and druid are
the cleric is able to cast any spell as a ritual, which takes a long time but costs virtually nothing. So out of action scenes, they can use their spells, but it takes a while to cast. Druids are able to use like the natural energy of the living world to heal. Now, a little bit of an idea here. So each of the 4 caster archetypes has something unique about them that makes them different. I really wanted there to be on the character side something different that you can do that some other caster can't. My intention is that as I add more to the Ahris world, I will add more options so that at character creation, you could say, well, I'm not interested in casting rituals as a cleric. I would like to be able to do this other special cleric-y kind of thing. So my intention is that not all druids necessarily have to be healer types in terms of one of their special abilities about being a druid, but could have other things. So I will add those things over time. I would just wanted to establish this from the jump.
All right, so we'll get into spell creation in a minute. And actually, the thing I'm going to raise here is in the spell creation rules, but it's something else. But it's linked to something else. So you've already mentioned it, that the casters have a different attribute they used. I couldn't find which attribute they actually used. There's a reference in the spell creation where it says blah blah, either based on insight, presence, or reason, depending on the archetype. So I went back to the things at the start of the magic chapter, and I could see where the essence was coming from, because it says it's like one thing plus another thing. So again, you can't dump a stat because they're using it. But I couldn't find there. Now it might just because again I'm skimming it and it's not in bold. I couldn't see there what each of the 4 different casters casting attribute was. And then I went back to the archetypes in the character creation section. I couldn't see it there either. So now either I'm just being rubbish and I'm not finding it, or it's not there.
You know what? Actually, I I I I think you got me. I think I do not explicitly say it. So the attribute, and I'll go back and fix this.
Right. I'm
The
glad it wasn't me. Well,
No, no,
I'm not
no.
glad. I kind of wished it was just me not finding it and you
I
have
think
done
it
it.
is. I think it is mentioned somewhere. I think it's in character creation, but good golly, there's just so much to it. The attribute that contributes to a caster's essence is their casting attribute. So for a cleric, it's insight. For a druid, it's also insight. Sorcerer is presence, and wizard is reason. But I'll go through. I'll make sure I'll add that to. That's my first errata point, just to clarify that.
Yeah. So sorry about that. But when I
No,
was
no,
looking,
don't worry about it.
I couldn't find that.
Don't
And
worry
I was
about
like,
it.
it's got
I
to be
want to
here.
know those things.
This is something so important and obvious. There's no way he's left it out. And then I read it and I read back through somewhere else, and I was like,
Let me make sure that
can't
I'll look
find it.
elsewhere and see if it is somewhere else. But
It's not in the two. I only looked in two. I looked in the write-ups of the 4 classes at the start of the Magic chapter, and I looked in the archetypes of those. But I haven't looked anywhere else. But in those 2 places,
okay,
I could find it.
I'll fix
Right.
that.
So
It's heavily implied, if not explicitly stated, but I'll make sure it's explicitly stated.
yeah, I mean, it says insight, presence, or reason, and I could guess the presence and the reason one, and then the insight one I was like, again, that's wisdom. So, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so the theory of how the spell creation in first, like the theory because you get, like you said, you give examples, because I read through the things. This is the thing. I've skipped the spell creation and I went to the examples.
I have an idea.
Go on.
I have an idea, because we've been at this for an hour. What I think we should do is do a very brief overview of spell creation, and then we ought to do an episode where we just do spell creation.
Oh, and do spell creation.
Yeah, and create some.
The actual basics of it is relatively straightforward. That essentially you have this idea. You choose a spell template, which we've already said links to one of the skills, and then you kind of decide. Well, the other way, you decide what you want your spell to do. And then based on what your spell is going to do, it is linked to one of the 6 skills based on whether it's like doing damage, it's interacting something, it's moving something, it will give you knowledge, or it's affecting you, which was survival,
or
and then
affecting a thing, which is operate.
Which is operate. And so that's the kind of, so once you've got that idea, that gives you the skill, and then you kind of work on, kind of like you said earlier, with talents to some extent, that as you then want to make the spell more complicated, there are ways of doing that. So as you're adding I want it to do more damage, I want it to have a longer range, bigger area, this kind of stuff. As you do that, essentially you have sort of, as far as I can see, there's 2 main ways you can do this. Either you increase the cost of the spell in essence, or you increase the difficulty to cast it. That's right. Yes. There wasn't a third one.
No. Now, So real quickly, you're absolutely right. Each spell is associated with a specific template. Yeah, and the problem is there are some gray, fuzzy wuzzy areas. And I mentioned this in explanations and details about the 6 skill-related spell templates. And that's where GMs and tables, they'll have to make the call themselves. It's like, where do they think this type of spell fits? The vast majority of them, in terms of me working through this, I found like it's really obvious where most of them fit. Some of them, it's a little murkier, but it's pretty obvious. So you choose the template, and the template has some default qualities or default stats to it. Like, how much does a basic fight spell cost? What is the basic difficulty of it? What's its range? What's its duration? And what do you roll? Okay. That is like, what's the attribute skill combination? Really easy. You start off, you use points to build the spell. Each time you build a spell, you start off with a number of points equal to your casting attribute bonus. So I got to be explicit about that. So if you're a wizard, your caster attribute is reason. So if you have a high reason, you might have an attribute bonus of 2. So each time you start off to build a spell, you start off with 2 points. Okay, great. You then spend points to do things like increase the range, increase the damage, add effects, add duration, whatever. You would then get points to spend by either by increasing the cost of the spell in essence, or increasing the difficulty to cast, or both. Now, what happens is, and you'll see this if you read through in detail the sample spells. And one thing, if you get the game, I mentioned this, I am explicit about this. The sample spells that I work through, the numbers do not take into account any attribute bonus. I created them for like for nobody. So if you decide to take one of the spells that I've already worked out, you say, oh, that's cool, I'm just going to use that. Remember to apply your caster's attribute bonus either to increase what's there or decrease the cost or difficulty. I didn't apply that. I didn't come up with a generic caster with a generic attribute bonus to account for those things. So, but yeah, you spend points to get the things you want, and you get those points by increasing the cost or difficulty or both. What this results in early, when you're a brand new character, if you want a spell that, like, if you want to do fireball, medium range, couple of dice of damage, area effect, that's probably going to be like 6 or 7 points of essence. You're going to burn through half your essence or more with that one spell. That's just unless it's really difficult to cast, and then it will be cheap, but most of the time you might not be successful in casting it. I did that on purpose because a brand new spellcaster shouldn't be able to blast his or her way through any and everything. The nice thing with this, I'm happy with this innovation, is that you can adjust spells, the points of the quantitative and the qualitative aspects of spells with experience points. So over time, as you gain experience as a spellcaster, you could reduce the difficulty or cost or both of a spell and add things to it, like your crappy little flame blast spell that you built as a brand new character that can only go to close range and only does, a couple of dice worth of damage and doesn't have the area effect. You could increase the range, you could add area, and over time you could make it cheaper. So you have a choice as a caster through experience to continuously shape your spells instead of like discarding them and getting new ones, or you could add new spells, or both. And that's one thing that I'm really happy with.
And I think both of these two things are really clever. The fact that, because you could have spent hours doing a whole bunch of spells, but by giving a spell creation system, you both saved yourself a bit of work.
Yes.
And it didn't, because you'd spent ages doing this. But in theory, you saved yourself a bit of work. But you also then meant that anyone can come along and make spells for this.
Yep.
Now, yes, people will be able to create, broken spells, but that's always going to be the case. But the whole point is you don't create them by yourself. You create them with the GM. So the GM is going to be able to go, no, you can't do that.
Right.
We'll tweak this. But the fact that you can then, and the actual spell creation is relatively straightforward. It is literally what we've just said. I mean, the only thing I've seen similar is in the Genesis role-playing game. They kind of have this, but theirs are meant to be done on the fly, which is a ball ache, because every time you cast a spell, you literally have to on the fly go, right, I want to add this and this and this, and my difficult. So like every spell you cast, and they don't have the two, you have two axes. You have the cost to cast in terms of these essence points, and you have the difficulty. Genesis only has difficulty. So you can easily make these spells at low level, like level 5 spells that you never succeed in casting.
Right.
So you then go, oh, I'm going to cast a simpler spell. So
let's just be, I want to be really
pain.
clear about that. Spell creation is outside of the game.
Yes.
You don't create spells on the fly, GM or player. You don't do that. You create them and then you use them at the table. Using it at the table is boneheaded easy and fast. Yeah. It's like any other weapon or anything, any skill use. I wanted to keep, I hate stuff that slows things to a grind at the table. So spell creation is something that, like, you as a GM, you have like your big bad nemesis character that's going to, be the bane of the character's existence. You should make that character unique. You should make its abilities and its spells unique. And so you sit down, you're like, oh, it'd be really cool if that like necromancer could do this and this and this. And so you create those spells. And then as a player, obviously, you would establish the limits with your GM as to like, well, where, the limits in the gray areas, and then you'd create your own spells,
And I think the spell creation rules are reasonably straightforward. They're not something you do in play again. It's, the reason they're making a character. But then you have given these really clear examples, and you haven't just given one. Like, this is the kind of thing where we would see in loads of role playing. They would give you one example. You've given us one basic example, and then you've got this cleric example. In fact, you've done technically 2 cleric examples. And then we've got the sorcerer spell. And so you've given us a bunch of different examples of different spells. Whereas most other things we go, well, here's one example of making a spell. And you've given us a bunch of examples, plus then on top of the other ones where someone could sit down there and work out the maths behind the spells. And actually, it wouldn't be a bad idea to release like a separate document, because it doesn't want to be part of the book. It wouldn't be very interesting, but a separate document which just has the maths behind all of the other spells, just in terms of like, so freezing ray. Okay, well, freezing ray is this, and this is where the rest of the,
well, that's there actually, page 107.
Right, it actually says 5. It says it underneath. I'm talking crap.
Yeah,
that's because it's on some of them, but not all of them.
Well, so what I did, what he's talking about is at the end of the magic chapter, I have about 20 some odd spells. I made at least 3 per template, so 3 per skill.
That was clever. Didn't realize you'd done
to show different kinds of spells. And then so I have the stat block for the spell, the end product, but then I wrote a paragraph or so explaining how I got those points to try to make sense of it. And a lot of those were very cut and dry. Some of them were a little more challenging to make. And so I explain, how did I arrive at these numbers using this creation system? This is how I got there. This is where I made a call, and this is where it clearly fits within the rules as I have established. Now, my goal, my plan is moving forward, I will release like pay what you want short collections of spells, like a document with 10 spells, 10 spells with this same treatment. Here's the final product that you would then apply attribute bonus points to as you wish. And here's the explanation of how I got there. This is like a muscle memory. It's like a mental muscle memory kind of thing. I beat on it a lot. I'm happy with it now. I do understand that some people will probably not like it, and some people will look at it and maybe be a little confused by it initially. I think it's the kind of thing that if you work through a couple of times, you'll be like, okay, I get it now in terms of what the wacky author intends, but more importantly, I get it for how I'm going to use it at my table, and then you're good to go. So I will release spells along those lines.
The thing I kind of like with this, though, is because once someone's made spells, I'll give a perfect example here. You've got a spell which is basically light. It creates a light that illuminates the whole zone, and it's like 10 minutes times your ATB. It's quite a long time. But this spell costs quite a lot. But there's nothing stopping the player going, it seems really expensive. And like by the rules of how you work, and you explain where the points come from. There's nothing stopping the GM going, yeah, you're right. In D&D, this is a level 1 spell. This seems right. Well, let's just knock it down to a lower cost, because it doesn't really matter there, does it? Whereas like, your ball of fire is a massive cost thing, and it's doing decent damage over a whole area and setting people on fire. That wants to be expensive. But, and mind you, put the maths in of it. It means if someone does want to go, it would be silly to throw out the entire system because one of the examples is overpriced. There will just be things where someone's going to go, well, it's a matter, like you said, kind of a matter of opinion. The GM has to make a decision, and one GM is going to put more or less like importance on a particular thing. So it's a nice, easy thing to tweak. It's not,
Yeah, let me throw this out there. Actually, that's a really great idea. You could take any of the 20 some odd sample spells and just change them a little bit if you don't want. That is, like once you say, okay, my wizard who has an attribute bonus of 2, I'm going to use this, but I'm going to tweak it in this way. Like Ball of Fire, as it's written, does 3 CD of damage. Its area and has persistent 1. Medium range, difficulty 3 to cast, cost 8 essence. Now, remember though, what it doesn't take into account is that damage for a spell is your attribute bonus plus the dice. So that if you had a wizard with an attribute bonus of 2, this thing would do 5 CD plus the area plus persistent 1. That should cost a lot for a new caster. Now, if you decide that you don't want it to cost, and by the way, you would also have the 2 attribute points, the 2 points that you get from that. So you could lower the cost to 6. That would still probably burn through half or more of your essence in one shot. But that's 5 CD of damage, area, persistent 1 out to medium range. That's a monster. But you could decide to dial that back if you wanted to. You know, or tweak some piece of it. Get rid of area to make it cheaper. That's going to knock the price down by 2. Get rid of persistent 1. That's going to knock the price down by 2. So you don't have to take these spells as they are. You can take these spells as examples, apply your character stats wise to them to reduce and change things, but you could also dial them back and tweak them to make them more what you want. Whereas in the vast majority of other fantasy games, the spell is the spell, you take it or not, that's it. So that's what I wanted to give people. That's what this does.
Yeah. And like I said, I think from what you got here, the magic is a big thing. You can take this magic system, make a whole bunch of spells, or you could tweak it to do, slightly new. But the fact that you've got it and you're out there and it's a spell system and it, would appear that it's going to do the job based on the rules you've done. I think the very fact that you've gone with these 6 skills has made the magic system like a little bit easier to work with, because then you've got these 6 templates which work from those 6 skills, which I think was a good idea. I think, if you'd end up with if you'd gone, say, 10 skills, you wouldn't have been able to do that.
No, and you know what? And instead of, like Octone Cthulhu, I like the fact that you have a governing attribute for depending if you're a caster, but then depending on the nature of the spell, you use a different skill. So that's where I got that from. It enables people to specialize. Sure, it does. But it also forces you to accept the cost of specialization, because you're not dumping points into other skills or focuses that would make you more of a generalist. You can be more of a generalist caster no matter what archetype you choose, or you could be more focused, but by focused, limited. So yeah, that portion, that chapter 7, caused headaches and gray hair. I'm sure of that. I know the former. I'm confident of the latter for me. But here's something also, and I say this in the book. It would be really easy, given all the SRDs that are online, to just go to the spells section of an SRD that's online and just start converting spells. I am neither going to confirm nor deny that that's what I did for my sample spells. And again, my intention is that someone who's interested in or familiar with, to some degree, 2D20, any system, I hope will take this and go, I'm going to play some spell slinging, hack and slash, high adventure fantasy, and I'm going to convert my 5e friends, because there's common ground here, but we've got a much better system.
Yeah. Well, you can't create your own spells in 5e.
No.
So. And you certainly can't level them up. It's like you said, you have the only reason you cast low level spells is when you've run out of your higher level slots, but you use cantrips all the time because you don't run out of them.
Right. Yep. You're absolutely right. Yeah. And there's no reason to do that. You can add more spells over time through experience and have them be different and have a long list of spells. You could develop that over time. Absolutely. Or you could have a shorter list of spells, but continuously tweak them and add to them, improve them, and change them the way that you want to, based on how your character develops. There you go. I think what we ought to do is we should do an episode wherein we create a couple of spells.
Yeah, I think that'd be a whole episode. So
I think that, and we'll create some, whatever. I'm sure some of them will be really easy, and I'm sure some of them will be a little harder, and we have to make some judgment calls, but that's baked into the system, and I'll finish on this because we've been going for a while, but I did find myself falling into the Pathfinder trap on a number of occasions, and I had to back off from the cliff, where I realized after the fact I was writing too many rules. I was being too prescriptive, and I kept going back to be like, I have to be more descriptive. Like certain things, the fundamentals have to be prescribed. The base system has to be defined. Spell creation as a process has to be defined to an extent, but there's a point beyond which you go and you're becoming highly prescriptive. And that's when rules break, I think, unfortunately. It's like the as Mr. Scott said in Star Trek 3, the more complicated the plumbing, the easier it is to stop up. And so, yeah, there are places. I'm sure that there will be people who, like one of my players, created an invisibility spell that was thoroughly broken. The reason why I went through and wrote up invisibility and treated it the way that I did in this is in direct response to that, because he's just like, his mind works that way. He figures out all the min-maxing and optimization, and he's like perfect 5e player in that respect. And I don't say that in an insulting or left-handed manner at all. But it made me think, and I went back and I changed some things, but I hit a point where I was just like, I don't want to rule for everything. There needs to be rulings for a group by a GM in concert with players. So I like I said, I tried to lean toward description, especially with this, rather than very explicit prescription beyond the basics. And there you have it.
Yeah, like wow, the amount of work you put into this is just crazy, and like everything, like just things that went, but like the amount of monsters in it. I haven't even looked at the primer stuff for Ahris, because like,
I described the basics of the colony, the one colony on the continent, and then I provide some story seeds. I had a guy that I connected with through Reddit who did the maps. Did the map that's behind me, that's on the cover, and I thank him in the credits. He was just like, yeah, I'll do it. That's cool. So he's going to get a free copy of it. So I was very thankful for that.
But yeah, like just the amount of the stuff that's in here, and there's some really cool stuff. If you're wanting to do a fantasy game, we don't have to wait really for Modiphius to throw out Elder Scrolls anymore. You've got the things that were really important. You've got a bunch of them in here. Could there be more? Well, yeah, because you could have a giant, big, long spell list, which is probably what they would have done with Elder Scroll. Although I think you can make your own in the games. Actually, you can make your own spells. So, but since we still haven't had that announced, and the games that have been announced aren't coming out soon, this will probably be the main fantasy 2D20 thing for a couple of years at least. So yeah, you might make a bunch of money out of it and get your island.
I'll close with, yes, that's it. Hopefully another, I have 2 people have bought it so far in the last day. So I have 2 more handfuls of sand on my private island. Again, if you're interested in a high fantasy spell slinging type of thing, and you want to create your own world, or you are interested in just playing existing modules and campaigns from other existing fantasy worlds, I firmly believe that, and I did this in playtesting, converting is really easy. Converting characters, converting monsters, converting spells is really easy. So you can ignore Ahris as a world entirely and run the high action rules that are the default in this book, and there you go. If you're interested in the world that I'm setting forth, there's enough to get started in it, and then there are the grittier rules modifications that I point out and say, this is how I would run Ahris. And then from here forward, the content, both mechanical and story, that I'm going to produce is going to be for my own world.
I mean, it's like you said, the actual, this is a 200 and something page book.
Yes.
But it's 170 odd pages of rules and the games master and stuff and monsters. The Ahris stuff is like 10 pages.
Yep.
Everything else, okay, it's tied into the world, which is why you've got decisions about races and stuff and the archetypes and how this magic works and so on. But at the core of it, this is 150 plus pages of fantasy 2D20 for, $15. So,
yep.
Of course, I can say it's worth it and get it because I haven't paid it. It's worth it. Go and get it.
Cool. So then we will follow up here before too long with an episode where we create some spells.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea.
All right, excellent.
Well done.
Thank you so much for listening. You can visit our show's homepage at anchor.fm/fluffncrunch. That's FLUFFNCRUNCH. We would really appreciate feedback and reviews on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to this on. Thanks so much.